Chapter 4. A Little Cottage Gossip. A Visit of Charity. Practical Benevolence. The promptitude of the measures taken by Mr. Joseph Parsons to bring to effect the wishes of his master showed him to be deserving the post of confidence he held as principal superintendent of Sir Matthew Dowling's factory. He lost not a moment in obtaining a short interview with one of the parish officers, who was his particular friend, and then made his way to Hoxley Lane with the intention of questioning the widowed mother of the two Armstrongs as to the situation of her affairs, and the particular species of misery from which she might, at the precise moment, be suffering the most. The statement pronounced in Sir Matthew's kitchen respecting the general eligibility of Hoxley Lane as a place of residence was perfectly correct. It was the most deplorable hole in the parish, a narrow, deep-rutted parish road, too hopelessly bad to be indicated. Led from the turnpike down a steep hill to the town of Ashley, exactly at the bottom of the hill, just at the point where every summer storm and winter torrent deposited their gatherings, there to remain and be absorbed as they might, began a long, closely packed double row of miserable dwellings, crowded to excess by the population drawn together by the neighboring factories. There was a squalid, untrimmed look about them all, that spoke fully as much of want of care as of want of cash in the unthrifty tribe who dwelt there. It was like the moral delinquencies of a corporate body, of which no man is ashamed, because no man can be pointed at as the guilty one. It was not the business of number one to look after the filth accumulated in front of number 2, and the inhabitants of number 3 saw no use in mending the gate that swung on one hinge, because number 4 had no gate at all, and the dogs and the pigs who made their good entry there, of course, found their way easily enough through the make-believe hedge, which, throughout the road divided one tenement from the other. The very vilest rags were hanging before most of the doors, as demonstration that washing of garments was occasionally resorted to within. Crawling infants, half-starved cats, mangy curs, and fowls that looked as if each particular feather had been used as a scavenger's broom, shared the dust and the sunshine between them, while an odor, which seemed compounded of a multitude of villainous smells, all reeking together into one, floated over them, driving the pure, untainted air of heaven aloft, far beyond the reach of any human lungs abiding in Hoxley Lane. "Where does the widow Armstrong live?" demanded Mr. Parson of a woman who was whipping a child for tumbling in the dunghill before number 5. "In the back of kitchen number 12, please, your honor," replied the woman, making a low reverence to the well-known superintendent. "Number 12? Why, that's Sykes' tenement, and they're on the ground floor themselves." "Yes, please, your honor, but since the rents have been raised by Sir Matthew, the Sykes have been obliged to let off the back kitchen and live in the front one." "Why, there's dozens of 'em, isn't there?" "Yes, your honor, they lies terribly close." "Obstinate doltheads. That's just because they pretend to fancy that it's not good for the small children to work. I know for certain that they have got about two above 5 years that they won't send to the factory, and they'll have the audaciousness to complain that the rents are raised, as if because they are above choosing to earn money in an honest way. Sir Matthew was not to make what he could of his own. 'Tis disgusting to see such airs, where people ought to be thankful and happy to get work." "That's quite true, no doubt, sir," answered the woman, continuing to shake and occasionally to slap the grub of a child she had taken off the dunghill. "But Robert Sykes' children are very weakly, and them as your honor talks of is almost too small, though 'tisn't to be doubted that it is bounden duty of us all to send 'em, sooner or later, than see 'em starve." "I fancy so, indeed," replied Mr. Parsons, adding, with the finger pointed at the squalling child, who still continued under the cleansing process above described. "And isn't it quite a comfort now, Mrs. Miller, to get rid of the plague of 'em?" The woman ceased to shake her little boy, and looking for a moment at the clear blue eyes that, notwithstanding her rough discipline, were very lovingly turned up to her face, something like a shudder passed over her. "Get along with you, Bill," she said, as if afraid that the blighting glance of the superintendent should rest upon him, and then added, "As long as they be so very small, your honor, they can't do no good if they be sent." "Stuff and nonsense! There's ways of teaching 'em, but don't fancy that I want you to send your brats, confound 'em. They're the greatest plagues in nature, and nothing on God's earth but a good-heartedness and love of his country would ever make Sir Matthew, for one, trouble himself or his men with any of those creatures. Number 12, is it, where I shall find the widow Armstrong? Yes, please, your honour. You'll be sure to find her. She's crippled, poor soul, can't stir. She's made up her mind to go into the workhouse, hasn't she? Demanded the manager. Have she indeed, poor thing? Responded the woman in an accent of compassion. I heard so, as I come along, and that's the reason I'm going to her. Our good Sir Matthew, who is to be sure the kindest-hearted man in the whole world, has taken fancy to her, boy, and he'll be a father to her. I'll be bound to say he will, and that's why I think he'd like me to give her a call, just to tell her not to fret herself about the workhouse. If she don't like going there, she needn't, I dare say, with such a good friend as she's got. The woman stared at him with an air of such genuine astonishment that the superintendent felt discouraged and abruptly turned away, continuing his progress down the lane. By the time he had reached number 12, however, he'd begun to doubt whether his sudden appearance at the bedside of the widow Armstrong might not produce an effect unfavorable to the object he had in view. As sure as steam, he thought, she'll be more inclined to fancy that I am come scolding about the boys for something than to take her part or do her pleasure. So I'll just say a civil word to the Sykes, and then stroll on away till such time as the parish officers have been after her. I'll engage for it that Sam Mchl won't let no grass grow under his feet after what I said to him, and if I turn in when he's there as if to see what was going on, it would be certainly more natural-like and believable. In accordance with this improved projet de charité, Mr. Joseph Parsons walked on, but he had not proceeded far ere, on turning his head round to reconnoitre, he perceived not the tall and burly Sam Mchl, the overseer of the parish, but the lean and lathy person of little Mchl, advancing with an eager and rapid step towards his mother's dwelling. So, ejaculated the sagacious parson, here comes the charity job. It'll be worth a week's wages to hear him tell his own story. Mr. Joseph Parsons had a Napoleon-like promptitude of action, which the unlearned operatives described by calling him a word and a blow man, which in reality often deserved the higher epithet above bestowed. Scarcely had the thought of overhearing little Mchl's tale suggested itself, ere a sidelong movement ensconced him for a moment behind a favouring pigsty, from whence, unseen, he watched the boy enter the door of number 12. Again, Napoleon-like, he remembered all he had heard from her neighbour concerning the position of the widow's dwelling-place, and rightly judged that Sykes' back kitchen must, in some way or other, be in a condition to favour the emission of sound. He troubled not the household by making his approach through the principal entrance, but striding over the inefficient fence of the tiny cabbage plot behind, obtained a station as favourable to his purpose as he could possibly desire. This was a nook between protuberance intended for an oven, and the window close besides, the widow Armstrong's bed, from whence prophetic fate, favouring the yet latent purpose of the manager, had caused 3 panes to be extracted by a volley of pebbles, intended for Mother Sykes' cat, at least 2 months before. To this safe and commodious crouching place he made his way just in time to hear the widow say, "Understand one word of Edward's story, Mike. So sit down, dear boy, and tell me all." "Why, mother, 'tis like a story-book, and it's very fine to be sure, but yet—" and the boy stopped short. "And yet you don't like it, Mike?" rejoined his mother. "That's what you were going to say. Tell the truth, my child. Don't keep nothing for me." "That was it," said Mike. "Ungrateful viper," muttered the confidential superintendent between closed teeth. "Poor fellow, poor dear Mchl," exclaimed the woman soothingly. "It was hard to go to sleep without kissing mother, wasn't it?" "Yes, I didn't like that. Nor I didn't like being without Teddy neither, and I didn't like the grumpy old lady as comed into the kitchen and abused me, nor the gentlemen's servants either, except the gardener, and he took hold of my hand and led me along kindly enough, and I like Molly too. That's a she as give me my supper and my bed and my breakfast this morning, mother. Oh, mother, how did I long to bring away some of the milk and bread and butter home with me." "Never think of such a thing for your life, boy," exclaimed the mother eagerly. "It would be thieving, nothing else, Mchl, nothing more or less than thieving. Never mention that again to me, dear, that's a darling." "I won't, mother, but I know I shall think of it every time I see them big pounds of butter and jugs of milk, and minds how careful you be over your little scrimp bit in the broken saucer, and how you drinks every drop of your tea without ever having any milk at all." "Never you mind that, darling. But what are they going to do with you, Mike? And what's for you to do, and what for do they want to have you up to the great house? 'Tis a mystery to me, and thankful as we ought to be for any help, I can't say but it should be easier in my mind if I understood something about it." "Impertinent hag!" growled the surly Parsons from his lair. "Does she think they are going to trap him like a rabbit for the sake of his skin?" "But, mother, I don't understand anything about it myself," said Michael, rather dolefully. To this avowal no reply was made for some minutes, upon which the superintendent grew impatient, and stretching forward his neck a little, contrived athwart the shelter branches of the elder tree to peep through the broken window. To the agent of Sir Matthew Dowling's benevolence, the sight that presented itself was really revolting, though there may be others who would have been affected differently by it. Michael had flung himself across the bed. His arms were thrown round his mother, who was sitting upright with some piece of needlework in her hands, and his dark curls set off in strong contrast the extreme paleness of the face that looked down upon him. The widow Armstrong was still rather a young woman, and would have been a very lovely one, had not sickness and poor living sharpened the delicate features and destroyed the oval outline that nature had made perfect. Yet she had quite enough of beauty left to detain the eye, and such a history of patient suffering might be read in every line of her speaking countenance, that few ever looked upon her harshly. Spite of her extreme poverty, too, she was clean. Her cap was clean, the bedclothes were clean, and the pale hands, too, looked so very white that if Mr. Parsons from his hiding place had ventured to speak any opinion concerning her, he would certainly have given utterance to a strong expression of indignation at the abominable air of delicacy which her appearance displayed. She looked as if she were struggling with some painful feeling, but did not weep, though her boy did heartily. For a little while she suffered his tears to flow without interruption or reproof, and then she kissed him once, twice, thrice. "There now, Michael," she said, looking at him fondly, "have you not played baby long enough? Stand up, darling, and listen to me. You don't seem over-glad, Mike, of this great change, and if you did, perhaps I might have been over-sorry, but sorrow would be sin for either of us when God has sent us help. 'Tis you that be the heartiest, Mike, and 'tis you that want the food the most, growing at the rate you do, and the heart-sore have I been at meal-times to see you so stinted. So never let us trouble ourselves any more about the reasons for your getting so into favor, but just thank God, and be contented." "But, mother, how will you get on without me?" replied Michael, shaking his head. "I am sure that Teddy can't make your bed as I do. He hasn't the strength in his arms. And who's to fetch the water? Deed, mother, you'd better thank Sir Matthew and say no, unless he just please to let Teddy go instead." "That won't do, my dear child, in any way. 'Tis I must watch poor Edward. Little as I can do for him, I don't think he'd like to part from me, as long as God is pleased to let me stay." "That's true, mother, that's very true. Teddy would break his heart. No, 'tisn't he shall be parted from you. I'll show him how to make you the bed, if I can't come over myself, but perhaps they'll let me, mother." "What's the business that you'll have to do, Michael?" inquired the widow. "I haven't been told any business yet," replied the boy. "But you don't expect that you're going to be kept for nothing, dear," said the mother, smiling. "'Tisn't for my work, mother, 'tis for the cow," replied Michael gravely. "The cow, child? What is it that you and Teddy have got into your heads about a cow? A poor starved beast, says he it was, that wouldn't have frightened a mouse, and that you made it turn round, Mike. That's all I could make out, but he must be mistaken, surely. What did you do about the cow, darling?" At this question the boy burst into a hearty fit of laughter, which is to say truth, offended the listening ears of Mr. Joseph Parsons still more than his weeping had done. "I'll do his business for him, he may depend upon it," thought he. "If master must have a charity job, he must. But it don't follow that that creature shan't be made to know himself just as well as if he were in the factory. I'll be your overlooker yet, Master Mike." Yet this prophetic sketching of the future had made itself distinctly visible in his mind's eye. The bodily sense of the agent announced to him that the tranquil tete-a-tete within the widow's chamber was disturbed by the entrance of persons, whose voice and step announced that they were men. Mr. Parsons was at no loss to guess their errand. "Here they come," muttered he. "We'll see how Master Mchl manages his job." "We'd be come to see," said a gruff voice within the widow's chamber, "whether or no you be coming to your senses, Mrs. Armstrong." "Sir?" said the trembling woman in return. "You know well enough what I mean. Without me going into it again, you know well enough that I have come to talk to ye about the house again. We've had Larkins the baker come in to inquire if there's a parish pay to look to for your bill, Miss Armstrong, and I have told him no, not a farthing, not a quarter of a farthing, unless you'll come into the house. The parish have gone on allowing you 2 shillings a week, week after week, God knows how long. 'Tis a perfect shame, an imposition, and the board says it won't do it any longer. You and the boys, too, may come if you will. That's one thing, but living here, crammed in without as much as wheaten bread as they eat without paying for, is another. And it's what no honest parish don't tolerate, I'll be bound to say now, as you brought up the scamps without their ever knowing the taste of gruel. Tell the truth, did you ever take the trouble to make a drop of gruel for 'em?" "As long as I had my legs to stand upon, sir, I never minded trouble, and when my husband was living we did a deal better, and I have done cooking for him, such as a few potatoes and cabbage, may be, with a scrap of bacon on Sunday, but from the hour he died we never had a pot to put a pot upon the fire." "That's what 'tis be so obstinate. If you'd come into the house you'd see the pot upon the fire all day long, a'most." "But the children would be in one room after they came from the factory. I should be in another," pleaded the widow. "I've got a few of the decent things as I was married with when I came from service, and it would be a grief to me to see 'em all sold." "If the parish don't sell 'em, Larkins the baker will. You may take my word for it, Mrs. Armstrong," replied the overseer. "However, 'tis your business, not mine. Here's a decent, respectable man, as if ready to take you all. You've got a valuation, fair and honourable, but that's just as you please. I only called as duty bound to tell ye that the parish don't mean to continue no such extravagance as paying you 2 shillings a week no longer." "God help me," answered the widow gently. "If 'tis his will that it should be so, it would be a sin for me to complain." "That's vastly fine, bean't it?" said the brutal Mchl. "Now let's hear what you'll be after saying to Mr. Larkins, that as here he comes, as sure as eggs be eggs." An abrupt and most peremptory demand for £3, 2 shillings and 7 pence was here made by a sour-looking little man, who entered the small room without ceremony, making a group of intruders round the widow's bed, equally unwanted and unwelcome. Her overtaxed courage seemed to fail, for it was with something like a sob that she replied to his demands by saying, "I shall have 12 shillings to take for needlework when this is done, and you shall have every farthing, sir, if you'd be so merciful." "And who's to pay your rent, Mrs. Armstrong, if I may be so bold?" said Mr. Mchl. The widow had not said a word for herself, and, covering her face with her hands, wept bitterly. "Now's my time," said Parsons to himself, as he stealthily crept from his hiding-place. "Now for Sir Matthew's benevolence," and in a minute afterwards his tall, gaunt figure and hard countenance were added to the company. The noise he made in entering caused the widow to uncover her eyes, and it was with an emotion little short of terror that she recognized the tyrant, at whose name her children's cheeks grew pale. Instinctively she stretched out her hand and took hold of that of Mchl, who was still seated on the side of the bed. But the boy shook it off, as if his mother's love was a secret treasure that the overlooker must not see, and suddenly standing up, he remained with his eyes fixed upon the ground, and his hands hanging by his sides, as if petrified. "Hullo! What's the matter now? Is all the parish come to wish joy to this good woman here?" said the overlooker, with as jocund an air as he could persuade from his iron features to assume. "Wish her joy?" responded the well-tutored parish officer. "And for what, Mr. Parsons, if you please? For having an honest tradesman come upon her with a gripe of law, in hopes to get what's his own? She's got into trouble, I promise you, and I don't see well how she's going to get out of it." "You don't say so," said the confidential agent. "What, is that you, Mr. Larkins, coming to take the law of a poor body this way? I didn't think you was so hard-hearted." I don't deserve that character, sir, replied the baker sharply, for though desired to call and enforced his claim by parish overseer, Mr. Larkins knew not a word about Sir Matthew's scheme of benevolence. And the proof that my heart isn't harder than other people's, he continued, is that I gave the widow here credit for what has been, excepting a few ounces of tea, her whole and soul living for months past. And very kind of you, observed the conciliating superintendent. I should like to know, then, what became of all the money the two boys got, besides her own needlework, and, of late, 2 shillings a week from the parish besides, observed Mr. Mchl. Why, that's rather puzzling, I must say, replied Mr. Parsons. But no matter for that just now. This family's got a kind friend, I promise you. Yes, but it does matter, returned Larkins. It can't be right, nohow, for me to be out £3, 2 shillings and 7 pence, and she with such lots of money. Indeed, sir, said the widow, once more looking up at him. I have done my very best, paying a little and a little at a time, as you know I never stopped doing. Only for 2 weeks that my biggest, that is my oldest boy, was making up time that was lost when he was home sick and got no wages. But the 7 shillings a week that they get between them, and my uncertain bit of needlework, gentlemen, I can't stand for food and clothes and rent, and a little soap to keep us decent, and a bit of firing to boil a drop of water. It can't do all that, gentlemen, without getting behindhand, and without making up when any making up of time comes in the factory. Well, then, that's just the reason why you must come into the house, replied Mchl, and, at any rate, you may depend upon getting no more money out of it. Upon hearing these words, the decent, respectable man, who was willing to take the widow's goods at a valuation fair and honourable, began examining the condition of a chair that stood near him, an operation with which the widow eyed with most piteous look most pitiful and imaginable. Come into the house, I tell you, without any more ado, resumed Mchl. What, in God's name, do you think we want you in there for but your own good? Do you think the parish have fancy for maintaining crippled women and children by way of pleasure? 'Tis ruination anyways, but when you're in, we know the worst of it at once, and that's something. The boys' wages will go a bit to help, and at any rate there'll be no 2 shillings to pay, which is what the overseer hates above all things, and what they won't continue to do. So now I have said my say. And here Mr. Mchl began to move his heavy person towards the door. Stop a minute, Mr. Mchl, if you please, ejaculated Sir Matthew's superintendent. I should be sorry to let you go back to your employers under any delusion or mistake whatsoever. And the fact is that this good woman, the widow Armstrong, is no more likely to go into the workhouse than you are yourself, Mr. Mchl, begging your pardon for naming such a thing. Then I suppose it's yourself as means to keep her out of it, Mr. Parsons, replied the parish officer jocosely. Not exactly me myself, replied the other in the same tone, but that's as one is much more able he is willing. It is Sir Matthew Dowlings as intends to befriend her, and that not only on account of the general charitableness of his temper, which all who know him really well are quite aware is very great, but because that little boy stands there, and who is one of our factory children, saved a friend of Lady Dowlings last night from something she took upon to be considerably danger. And does Sir Matthew mean to see me paid? Demanded the baker. Upon my word, Mr. Larkin, that's more than what I've got authority to say, replied Parsons. But, howsoever, I don't think that you had best go on, just at this particular minute, to persecute about it, seeing that in course Sir Matthew won't take it civil, and him being such a friend himself to the widow. I don't want to do anything uncivil to nobody, replied the baker, but I don't quite understand this business. Is it something new, isn't it, Sir Matthew? Isn't it, Sir Matthew, setting up for a soft-hearted gentleman among the factory folk? New to you, maybe, Mr. Larkins, but it's not to me, replied the trustworthy agent. There isn't another to be found, look which way you will, that could be compared with Sir Matthew Dowling for real, benevolent charitableness when he finds proper objects for it. The baker stared. The man of old chairs and tables scratched his puzzled head. The intelligent Mr. Butchell looked at the speaker with a knowing wink. The widow fixed his eyes upon her patchwork quilt, and little Michael, in astonishment which conquered terror, raised his eyes to the superintendent's face, while that worthy advocate of a master's virtues stood firm, striking his stout cane upon the ground with the air of a man ready to do battle with all the world in support of what he had asserted. "Well, then, at any rate, my business is done and ended," said Mr. Butchell, moving off, "and I wish you joy, Mrs. Armstrong, of your unaccountable good fortune." "Come along, Jim," said the baker to the respectable dealer of seized goods. "There's nothing to be done today, that's clear, but I hope you'll remember the 12 shillings as you promised me, Mrs. Armstrong." "I will indeed, sir," answered the widow earnestly, and, on receiving this assurance, Mr. Larkin took his departure with his professional friend, leaving Joseph Parsons, the widow Armstrong, and her son Michael to carry on whatever conversation they might wish for without interruption. "Well, now, if I ain't glad they're gone, them fellows," said the superintendent, shutting the door after them. "You're a favored woman, Mrs. Armstrong, to get rid of 'em as you have done, and I don't and won't question that you are thankful to those whom thanks are due." "I will always be so, sir," said the widow. "Well, there's no hardship in that, I suppose. But about this son of yours, this young Master Mchl, you must see to his doing his duty to his benefactor. If he was to prove ungrateful, Mrs. Armstrong, it is but fair to tell you that I wouldn't undertake to answer for the consequences." "God forbid he should be ever ungrateful to any as was kind to him," replied the poor woman. "But indeed, sir, I don't think it is in his heart to be so. Since the day he was born, God bless him, I have had little besides love to give him, and indeed, sir, I think the child would die for me." Michael slyly stole his little hand sideways under the bedclothes, where it soon clasped in that of his mother, but his eyes were again firmly riveted upon the ground. "Aye, aye, that's very well, but it has nothing to do in any way with his duty and obligations to Sir Matthew. What I want to know is, whether he is ready and willing to do that which Sir Matthew will require of him. That is the main question, you see, Mrs. Armstrong." "And what will that be, sir?" said the widow, while Michael's eyes were again raised for a moment to the face of his taskmaster. "He is to be made a gentleman of. That's to be the first work put upon him." The poor woman smiled, but little Michael shook his head. The superintendent appeared to pay no attention to either, but again striking his cane magisterially upon the ground, he added, "Let him be made up. Let him make up his mind to do all that he's bid, and come back to Dowling Lodge with as little delay as possible." With these words, and without deigning to bestow any species of parting salutation upon these to whom they were addressed, Mr. Parson left the room.